Housewife dumped in trash by husband. Just because of this. Unaware her father is a secret billionaire. Hello family, welcome back. Please do well to subscribe and let's know where you are watching the story from in the comment section. The rain was coming down hard that night. The kind of rain that made the streets shine under the dim streetlights, and the sound of it hitting the roof was like 1,000 tiny drums. Inside the small apartment, Sophie Miller was stirring a pot of soup on the stove. It was Mark's favorite, chicken noodle with extra carrots, because she knew he'd had a long week at work. She had even baked cornbread earlier, just to make the evening feel warm and welcoming. Sophie looked at the clock. It was past 9. Mark was never this late without calling. She wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and picked up her phone. No missed calls. No text. She tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. Her heart sank a little. He'd been distant lately. Less laughing, more sighing. Less, "How was your day, Sophie?" And more, "Why didn't you fix this?" Or, "Why is the place always a mess?" She shook the thought away. Maybe he's just tired, she told herself. People change when they're stressed. The door slammed open. Sophie jumped. Mark walked in, dripping wet from the rain. His face was stone. No smile, no hello. He kicked off his shoes without looking at her and walked straight to the small hallway. "Mark," Sophie said softly, "you're soaked. Let me get you a towel." "No," he snapped without turning around. Her heart started to race. "What's wrong?" He stopped in the hallway, still facing away. "Pack your stuff." The words didn't make sense at first. Sophie blinked. "What?" "I said pack your stuff. You're leaving tonight." Her hands went cold. "Mark, what are you talking about? Did something happen? Did I do something?" "You do everything wrong," he cut in sharply, finally turning to face her. His eyes were cold, his jaw tight. "I've been thinking about this for months. I can't live with you anymore." Sophie's voice trembled. "You can't live with me. Mark, we're married. We have each other. Whatever it is, we can fix it." He laughed bitterly. "Fix it? You can't fix being a disappointment, Sophie. I've been dragging you along out of pity." Her lips parted, but no words came. She could barely breathe. "You don't dress right. You don't know how to make something of yourself. All you do is sit here, cook, clean, and think that's enough." Her voice cracked. I thought you liked that I took care of you. I thought that's what we both wanted. That's what losers want, Sophie. I'm done being a loser." The words hit her harder than the rain outside. Mark walked into the bedroom and came out with her small suitcase. It was already half packed, with her clothes. Her hands shook as she reached for it. "Mark, please, this is our home. We can talk about—" "No more talking." He grabbed her arm, the grip tight enough to make her wince. "Get out." She pulled her arm back. "It's raining. At least let me—" But he was already dragging her toward the door. "Mark, stop." Her voice broke into a sob. "Please just tell me why you're doing this. You want to know why?" His voice was low but sharp. "Because you're nothing. You're a dead weight, and I'm tired of carrying you." He pushed the door open, and the cold air rushed in. The rain splattered against her face. Sophie looked around the street in panic, hoping maybe a neighbor would see, maybe someone would stop him. No one did. Mark pulled her out into the narrow back alley behind the apartment. The stench of wet garbage and the sound of rain hitting metal trash lids filled the air. He shoved her toward the overflowing bins. Her suitcase fell to the ground, splashing in a puddle. "Mark, please," she started, but he stepped back, shaking his head like he couldn't stand to hear her voice. "You're trash to me, Sophie, and I'm done pretending you're not." Her chest tightened. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She bent to pick up her suitcase, but the rain had already soaked everything inside. Mark turned away. "Don't call me! Don't come back! You're on your own!" "Mark!" she cried out. He stopped for just a moment, glancing back over his shoulder. There was no regret in his eyes. "Goodbye, Sophie." And then he walked back inside, the door slamming so hard the sound echoed in the alley. Sophie stood there, the rain running down her face mixing with her tears. Her clothes clung to her skin. The cold seeped into her bones. She looked up at the windows of the neighboring buildings. She could see shadows moving. Behind curtains, people had seen. But no one came out. No one asked if she was okay. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand straight. She picked up the suitcase, the weight heavier now that it was waterlogged, and dragged it out of the alley. Her mind was a blur. Where will I go? What did I do wrong? How could he? Every memory they had together flashed through her mind. How they met at a coffee shop. How he said he loved her more than anything. How they used to talk about having kids someday. Had it all been a lie? She didn't know how long she walked in the rain. She didn't notice the cars splashing water onto the sidewalk. She didn't even notice when her phone rang in her pocket. She just let it go. By the time she reached the small bus shelter at the corner, she could barely feel her hands. She sat down on the cold metal bench, her suitcase beside her. She stared at the empty street ahead. A thought came quietly at first, then louder. This isn't just heartbreak. This is something else. This is wrong. This is abuse. Her arm ached where he had grabbed her. She looked down and saw the faint red marks already darkening into bruises. She wrapped her arms around herself, not for warmth, but to hold herself together. She had no plan, no money, and nowhere to sleep. But she knew one thing. She couldn't go back, not even if he begged. Somewhere deep inside, beneath all the hurt and confusion, a small spark lit up. It wasn't anger yet. It wasn't even strength. It was just the quiet awareness that what Mark had done was cruel, inhuman, and wrong. She didn't know it yet, but that small spark was the beginning of something that would burn brighter than he could ever imagine. For now, though, Sophie just sat in the rain, staring at the dark street, wondering how a man who once said, "I'd never hurt you," could throw her away like she was nothing. And somewhere, in a warm apartment just a block away, Mark was pouring himself a drink, believing he had finally rid himself of the burden. He had no idea what he had just set in motion. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love you to join our community by hitting the subscribe button. Through our stories, we build hope and give future to children and women abused all over the world. Also, let us know in the comments where you are watching us from and how this story hit home for you. The next morning, Sophie woke to the sound of distant traffic and the hum of a vending machine. She was still sitting in the small bus shelter, her suitcase at her feet. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp and heavy. Her clothes were stiff from drying in the night air. She didn't know how she'd fallen asleep, but her body ached as if she'd been carrying bricks all night. The bus driver who pulled up looked at her curiously. "You okay, Mum?" he asked gently. Sophie forced a small smile. "I'm fine. Just waiting for someone." It was a lie, but she didn't want pity. She waited until the bus pulled away before she stood and dragged her suitcase down the street. By midday, she was sitting in a small coffee shop, warming her hands on a paper cup of tea she couldn't really afford. She had 5 crumpled bills left in her wallet. Her phone, which she'd ignored the night before, lit up on the table. It was a message from her neighbor, Mrs. Turner. "Sophie, I don't know if you know this, but I saw Mark with that woman again. The one with the red coat. I'm sorry." Sophie stared at the screen. The one with the red coat? Before she could type back, another message came from a younger neighbor, Ben. "Hey, I don't want to make things worse, but Mark was at the bar last night with Claire. They were close. Like they've been together a while." The words blurred in her vision. She read them again, slower this time, as if maybe she had misunderstood. Claire. She knew that name. Claire had been around once or twice when she and Mark were still friendly with people from his office. She was the kind of woman who spoke in a low, smooth voice and always looked perfectly put together. Expensive perfume, perfect hair, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mark used to joke about her being out of his league. Sophie had laughed it off. Now she realized it wasn't a joke at all. The pit in her stomach grew heavier. She thought of the way Mark had looked at her last night, the way he'd called her trash. She thought of the diamond necklace she'd once seen in a jewelry store, the one Mark told her was for people who live in a different world than us. And she thought of how Claire wore a necklace just like it the last time Sophie saw her. Sophie sat there for a long time, the tea growing cold in her hands. She could feel people walking past her table, laughing, talking about weekend plans, living their normal lives. She realized that if she wanted to survive this, she had to stop thinking like the Sophie who used to make soup and wait for Mark to come home. She pulled out her phone again and scrolled through her contacts. There was one number she hadn't called in almost 10 years. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over it. Her father's name stared back at her. Edward Miller. When Sophie was 18, her parents had divorced in a storm of shouting and slammed doors. Edward had moved out and never explained himself. She stayed with her mother, and over time, the phone calls stopped. She told herself she didn't care. But now, sitting alone with nothing but a wet suitcase and $5 to her name, she pressed the call button. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Hello? Dad?" Sophie's voice cracked. There was a long pause. "Sophie?" "Yeah, it's me." Another pause. "It's been a long time." "I know." She swallowed hard. I need help." The silence on the other end wasn't cold. It was heavy, like he was taking in every word. "Where are you?" She gave him the address of the coffee shop. He told her to stay put. 20 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up outside. Edward stepped out. He looked older than she remembered. His hair was grayer, his face more lined, but his posture was still straight, his eyes sharp. When he walked in, Sophie almost didn't stand. She felt like a child again. He sat across from her, looking her over. "You're wet," he said quietly. "It rained," she replied, almost embarrassed at the obviousness of it. "What happened?" She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. "Mark. He threw me out. In the rain. Into the trash. He's been with another woman for months. I didn't know until today." Edward's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "He called me worthless," she continued, her voice shaking. "He said I was holding him back, and he—" She stopped, looking down at her arm. The bruises were faint, but visible. Edward's eyes followed her gaze. "He put his hands on you." It wasn't a question. Sophie nodded. Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he said, "You're coming with me." No arguing. "I don't want to be a burden. You're my daughter." That's the end of that conversation. For the first time in days, Sophie felt something like relief. But Edward wasn't done. "I want every detail, every bruise, every word, everything he's done to humiliate you. You tell me, and I'll take care of the rest." She hesitated. "What do you mean, take care of it?" His voice was calm but firm. "I mean, I won't let him get away with it." They left the coffee shop together. Sophie didn't ask where they were going, but she noticed Edward made a call as soon as they got in the car. "Have someone gather information on Mark Bennett," he said into the phone. "Employment, Finances, Associates. And find out everything about a woman named Claire." Sophie turned to him. "You know people who can do that?" He gave her a small, almost sad smile. "I know more people than you think." For the first time, Sophie began to wonder what her father had been doing all these years. She had no idea that the man sitting beside her was far more powerful than Mark could ever imagine. That night, in Edward's large, unfamiliar house, Sophie sat in a guest room that was bigger than her old living room. She stared out the window, thinking about Mark and Claire, about the way he looked at her last night like she was nothing. She didn't know exactly what Edward had planned. But for the first time since the alley, she didn't feel powerless. She was still hurt, still angry. But now, she wasn't alone. And Mark Bennett was about to learn that throwing Sophie into the trash was the biggest mistake of his life. 3 days passed. Sophie stayed in her father's house, slowly getting used to the quiet luxury around her. The place was massive, high ceilings, polished wood floors, a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. But more than the size, it was the silence that felt strange. No shouting, no belittling comments, no door slamming. For the first time in years, she could breathe without feeling like she was walking on eggshells. Edward was polite, but she could tell he was keeping himself busy. Phone calls, meetings, people coming and going. She caught fragments of conversations. Find the paper trail. Get me those bank records. Yes, I want video if possible. She didn't ask questions. Part of her didn't want to know. On the 4th morning, Edward called her into his study. It was a large room with tall bookshelves and a massive desk that looked heavy enough to survive a hurricane. He was seated behind it, holding an envelope. "Sit down, Sophie," he said. She sat, and he slid the envelope toward her. "It's an invitation." For Mark, Sophie frowned. "An invitation to what?" "A private dinner," Edward said simply. "At the Grand Royal Hotel." Her heart skipped. "You're inviting him?" "I am," Edward said. "And Claire. It will look like a social opportunity. Something they'll be eager to attend." Sophie's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "Why?" Edward leaned back, his eyes sharp. "Because I want them to see you. I want them to realize what they threw away before I take everything from them." Her breath caught. "Dad, I know you don't want revenge," he interrupted. "But this isn't about revenge. This is about respect. He humiliated you in public. He violated your dignity. That's not just a personal matter. It's a human rights violation, and he will face the consequences." Sophie felt the familiar knot of anxiety twist in her stomach. What if he refuses to come? Edward's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. He won't refuse. Mark has always wanted to be somebody important. This dinner will smell like opportunity to him. He won't be able to resist. 2 days later, Mark Bennett stood in front of his bathroom mirror, straightening his tie. Claire sat on the bed behind him, adjusting the diamond necklace around her neck. "You're sure this Edward Miller guy is worth meeting?" she asked. Mark smirked at his reflection. "The Grand Royal doesn't host small-timers. If he invited us, he must think we're valuable. This could be the break I've been waiting for." Claire's lips curved in a satisfied smile. Finally. No more cheap wine. And leaky apartments. Mark chuckled. "Exactly. After tonight, we'll be in a different league." When they arrived at the Grand Royal, the valet whisked away their car, and the staff led them to a private dining room at the end of a long, carpeted hallway. The door was tall, polished, and guarded by 2 men in dark suits. Mark's pulse quickened. This was serious. The guard opened the door and Mark stepped in, only to freeze. Sitting at the far end of the long table was Sophie. She was wearing a deep emerald dress that shimmered under the chandelier. Her hair was styled, her makeup perfect, her posture calm and collected. She didn't look broken. She didn't even look angry. She looked powerful. Beside her sat Edward Miller, dressed in a tailored navy suit. His presence filled the room. Mark's mind scrambled. What is she doing here? Sophie's gaze met his. There was no emotion. In her eyes, just steady control. "Mark," Edward said, his voice deep and commanding. "Please, sit." Mark hesitated, then forced a smile. "Mr. Miller, I didn't know you and Sophie were acquainted." Edward's lips curved slightly. "We're more than acquainted. She's my daughter." Claire, who had been looking around the room with thinly veiled greed, stiffened. "Your daughter?" "Yes," Edward said. "And you are Claire, I presume." Claire swallowed, her confidence faltering for the first time that night. Edward gestured to the seats across from them. Please, join us. We have much to discuss. Mark and Claire sat, though Mark's hands were already clammy. The room was too quiet. The waitstaff moved like shadows, setting down plates without a sound. Sophie didn't say a word. She just watched him. Edward began to speak about business opportunities and partnerships, but his tone was casual. Too casual, like someone telling a story they'd already told many times. Halfway through the meal, Edward's voice shifted. You know, he said, leaning back slightly. It's interesting. I've been gathering information on the people my daughter keeps in her life, and I was surprised by what I found. Mark's fork froze halfway to his mouth. What do you mean? Edward's gaze hardened. I mean, I know exactly how you treated her. The public humiliation, the physical assault, the forced eviction during a storm. I know every detail. Mark's stomach dropped. Edward continued, his voice still calm. I also know about Claire. The months of infidelity. The promises of wealth in exchange for betrayal. I know everything. Claire's face flushed red. That's not... Edward cut her off with a single glance. Don't lie, not here. Mark swallowed hard. Look, You don't need to explain yourself to me, Edward said. You'll explain yourself to the police. Mark's blood ran cold. The police? Edward leaned forward slightly. You committed an assault, Mark. You violated my daughter's rights, and I have hospital records, witness statements, and video footage to prove it. Tonight, after this meal, officers will escort you to answer for it. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Mark felt the walls closing in. He looked at Sophie, hoping for some trace of the woman who used to forgive him for everything. But she only tilted her head slightly, her eyes calm. Edward's tone softened, but only slightly. Before the officers arrive, my daughter has something for you. Sophie reached into her bag and pulled out a set of papers. She placed them on the table and slid them toward Mark. He glanced down. Divorce papers. Mark stared at the papers as if they were written in another language. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Sophie didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze locked on him. You can sign them now, she said, her voice calm but steady. Or you can sign them later. Either way, we're done. The sound of her words hit him harder than anything Edward had said. He had expected tears, pleading, maybe even a second chance. But there was nothing in her tone, not sadness, not anger, just finality. Edward leaned forward. Sign them, Mark. Make it easier on yourself. Mark looked at Claire, hoping for some support, but she kept her eyes fixed on her wine glass, swirling the red liquid slowly, her face unreadable. He could almost hear the distance growing between them. With a shaky hand, he picked up the pen. The scratch of it against the paper seemed louder than it should have been. When he finished, Sophie reached over, took the papers, and placed them back in her bag without looking at them. A knock sounded at the door. 2 police officers stepped in, their presence quiet, but commanding. One of them addressed Edward. We're ready when you are, sir. Edward gave a slight nod. Take him. Mark's chair scraped loudly as he stood, his voice rising for the first time that night. Wait, you can't just... The officer cut him off. Mark Bennett, you are under arrest for assault and unlawful eviction. You have the right to remain silent. The words blurred in Mark's ears as cold metal cuffs clicked around his wrists. He looked at Sophie one last time, searching for some sign of the woman who once loved him. But she only met his eyes for a moment, and then looked away, as if he were nothing more than a stranger. Claire stood quickly, stepping back from the officers as they guided Mark toward the door. She didn't reach for him. She didn't even speak his name. When the door closed behind them, the room seemed larger, quieter. Edward poured himself a glass of water and took a slow sip before speaking. You deserve better than what he gave you. Sophie, She nodded, but her eyes were on the table, tracing the edge of her plate with her finger. I didn't know you were who you are, she said softly. Edward gave a small smile. I kept my life separate. I wanted to see if the people around you would value you for who you are, not what I have. He paused, his voice hardening slightly. Mark failed that test before he even knew it existed. Sophie let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. So all this time, you've been a very wealthy man, Edward finished. A billionaire, to be exact. And everything I have will go to someone who understands loyalty and kindness. You've proven you have both. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not just a father she barely knew, but a man who had been quietly watching, ready to step in when she needed him most. Edward stood and offered his hand. Come on. Let's go home. As they walked out together, the city lights reflected off the wet streets, the rain starting again in soft, steady drops. Sophie didn't look back at the hotel door. She didn't need to. Somewhere in the distance, Mark was sitting in the back of a police car, his future collapsing around him. Claire was already gone, slipping into the night without a backward glance, and Sophie, who had been thrown away like garbage, was stepping into a new life, one built on respect, truth, and the knowledge that no one would ever treat her that way again. Because she had learned something important. People who betray you may think they've won, but in the end, they're only writing the ending to their own downfall. And when that ending comes, it's never pretty.